Khalid, great to have you on the show. Thanks so much for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm okay. Thank you for having me.
So, Israel and UNRWA signed an agreement in 1967 after the Six-Day War, letting UNRWA continue its operations in Gaza and West Bank. And now Israeli parliament has passed laws banning UNRWA. Could you walk us through the history of Israel's relationship with UNRWA?
Sure. Well, UNRWA was created in December 1949 and was began its operations in 1950. And since then, it's been working with Palestine refugees primarily in places like Jordan and Lebanon and Syria, but also in the West Bank and Gaza, which at that time were not under Israeli control. And so the vast majority of the refugees were in areas outside of Israel's control. But Israel at the time welcomed UNRWA's creation, and they continued to cooperate with UNRWA after 1967. At that time, Israel's government viewed UNRWA as an asset, both because of its stabilizing influence, because obviously an organization that provides education and health services and other basic services to Palestinian refugees, that would be a stabilizing force because the alternative is desperation, and that typically often leads to violence. So, but there were other reasons that Israel at that time welcomed UNRWA's existence, and that is because they saw the establishment of homes and schools and health services for Palestine refugees as an alternative to a political resolution for the refugee problem, which would ultimately revolve around some form of return to their former homes and what is now Israel. So dealing with UNRWA was far more preferable because it was seen as a substitute for a political resolution. And that view held in Israel for many decades. It was really only in the last 20, 25 years that as Israel kind of shifted more and more to the right, that any acknowledgement of Palestinian refugees or refugee rights was seen as a threat. So the effort to undermine UNRWA in Israel, and by extension in the US Congress and other places, really began in the early 2000s, but took off during the Trump era in particular, because you had a Republican administration that was ideologically very sympathetic to the far right wing in Israel. And so that's why we saw the Trump administration, for example, was the first to cut off all US assistance to UNRWA. Up until that moment, the United States had been the largest single donor to UNRWA for, since its creation. And I should point out also that from the United States' standpoint, the reason the U.S. became the first and largest donor to UNRWA's operations was out of a sense of responsibility for the creation of the refugee problem in 1948 in the first place. There was an acknowledgement that America's insistence on partition and the rush to recognize Israel immediately after it was created, that was there was a recognition that that was one of the primary causes to the refugee problem. The dispossession of most of Palestine's population. So that's the reason that the U.S., out of a sense of moral obligation, as well as an interest in political stability, that the U.S. supported those efforts.
The legislation received an overwhelming majority in the Knesset with 92 in favor. What does this indicate about the current political climate in Israel?
Well, I think it really underscores, along with other developments in the Knesset, I think it underscores the extent to which extremist ideology and extremist ideas have taken hold in Israeli politics. And so we saw a few earlier a vote, a similar vote by the Knesset, I mean, by a similar margin, overwhelming support. I think if you look exclusively at Jewish Zionist parties in Israel, I think it's almost unanimous. But there was a similar vote about a two-state rejecting a two-state solution by almost the same margin. And so I think both of these votes tell us a great deal about the extent to which extremism has taken hold over not just the ruling coalition, but over the body politic in Israel in general, as well as in large segments of Israeli society.
Are there any specific factors or events you think that led Israel to label UNRWA as a terrorist organization or is pushing it to shut down its operations?
Well, I think October 7th was seized on as an opportunity to pursue a number of different objectives in addition to the stated aims of defeating Hamas and releasing hostages and so forth. I think the very extreme government in Israel has used the opportunity to relaunch the attack on UNRWA. If you remember back in January, I think it was almost the day after the International Court of Justice ruled that there was a plausible risk of genocide and that the international community had a responsibility to prevent it. That is when we saw almost immediately these allegations by the Israeli government against UNRWA employees, against a small number of UNRWA staff who they claimed were involved in the October 7th attacks. We're talking about a very, very small number, less than 10 individuals who, out of tens of thousands who are employed by UNRWA. And the response from the international community was exactly what Israel had wanted, and that was to immediately suspend all assistance to UNRWA in the most serious humanitarian crisis that Palestinians have faced in their history, and that UNRWA has ever been involved in, even before there was any evidence produced. Later on, when the evidence was shown to not be very convincing, all of the international donors, with the exception of the United States, have since resumed their financial support to UNRWA. So obviously October 7th played a major role, but I think in an opportunistic way. I think Israel has, the Israeli government and large parts of the civil society have used the October 7th terror attacks as another pretext to go after UNRWA, and with these kind of hyperbolic claims that UNRWA is a terrorist organization, it's been infiltrated by Hamas. There's been very, very little evidence provided on to back up any of these allegations, but that hasn't prevented the Knesset from acting in this very decisive way.
UNRWA operates extensively in that region. What would be the humanitarian repercussions for Palestinian refugees when UNRWA shuts down?
Well, the areas that we're looking at, in particular, Gaza and the West Bank, would be the most directly affected. Obviously, Israel doesn't have jurisdiction over UNRWA operations in places like Jordan or Lebanon, but we know for certain that it would be more than catastrophic in a place like Gaza. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is already, it's been described as hellish, as completely unbearable, inhumane in every possible way. And right now, UNRWA Israel is widely understood to be deliberately restricting humanitarian assistance to UNRWA. To the extent that humanitarian aid is getting to the 2 million people in Gaza, UNRWA is the most central player in that operation. It is the backbone of the entire international UN-based humanitarian effort. It coordinates with all the other aid groups, and it is the backbone of that operation. To take UNRWA out of that role, there is no other institution that can play the same role that UNRWA has. Simply, they don't have the staff, they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have those capabilities. But to do so in an environment where people are already dying of disease and starvation, and where shelters are being bombed, is, I mean, there are probably no words to describe how catastrophic it would be. It would just mean massive amounts of death.
Final question, Khalid. Given the 90-day deadline that UNRWA has been given to wind down its operations, is there any likelihood of this ban getting reversed or modified, or does UNRWA have any legal options to challenge or delay the implementation of this legislation?
There isn't a lot that UNRWA can do by itself as an institution. UNRWA gets its mandate from the UN General Assembly, so there are steps that the General Assembly could take. There are sanctions that could be imposed. One option could be to suspend Israel's membership in the General Assembly. There are other steps that could be taken along those lines. In the meantime, during this 90-day period, I think the focus, I think everyone understands, everyone except the Israeli government, understands that it simply cannot be allowed to be implemented because it would be catastrophic. So the focus of the United States and other actors in the diplomatic realm, I think, are trying to persuade the Israelis to delay implementation at an absolute minimum, to indefinitely suspend, to go beyond the 90 days, because it's simply not, it's just not conceivable that UNRWA could stop functioning. And from a legal standpoint, according to the ICJ ruling, third countries like the United States and European donors, the Japanese and others, they have an obligation already to ensure that they are in compliance with international humanitarian law by not assisting Israeli efforts to restrict humanitarian aid. And so they are also, I think, liable from a legal standpoint. But my sense is that the United States in particular is going to be working very quietly behind the scenes, trying to persuade the Israelis not to implement or to delay for as long as possible implementation. I don't see a reversal happening on the part of the Israeli government, except in the case perhaps of an extreme sanction like their membership in the UN General Assembly is suspended. But short of that, I think it will just take an enormous amount of arm twisting by the United States and others just to delay implementation.
Thanks for your time and insights. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.